Well, in the wake of the horrible situation in Dallas where 5 policemen were essentially assassinated by a Black Lives Matter activist, a lot of Americans are looking around and they're beginning to ask themselves, are we on the edge of an actual race war? Hi, everybody. I'm Bill Whittle here with Steve Green and Scott Ott, and this is your Right Angle show on After Dallas, in the aftermath of the Dallas shooting, which certainly was some kind of a horrible milestone that is going to divide this era a little bit, I think. And while we've talked a little bit on our other segments on this about the role of the police, I'd like to look this time at the larger issue of race relations in America. I don't think there's a person alive who thinks that the situation between the races is better today than it was before Barack Obama took office. Every single time that we see one of these police interactions that are questionable, the president jumps in on the side of the victim, and then next thing you know, half the country believes that policemen just drive around in cars waiting to assassinate people walking down the street. And it didn't used to be this way. And so my premise is simply this today, gentlemen. My premise is that so much of this tension is in fact caused by the political correctness that was supposed to diffuse all of this stuff. So, Steve, let's start with you. You have a very politically incorrect persona. I know you're not acting, but you basically you basically your thing is that you drink consistently and heavily, and you drunk blog events, but you're clearly not an alcoholic. So you are taking on an anti-PC position as a statement of principle and for humor. So coming off of that background, what do you make about things like the Dean Martin roasts from back in the day where Sammy Davis Jr. or some of these, or Muhammad Ali, and the jokes and the things that could be said directly to people's faces seem to be a much more comfortable time than it is today?
Oh, I miss those days. We in some ways it was better, in some ways it was worse. The legal situation it had just stopped being horrible with the knocking down the evil Jim Crow laws and the passage of in the 50s and 60s of, what was it, 2 or 3 major civil rights acts. We needed those things. The laws were imperfect, sure, but we're imperfect. But there seemed to be a camaraderie that is lacking now with this political correctness. And a few weeks ago on one of these segments, I argued that nationalism is sort of the idiot's version of patriotism. And the problem is that nationalism devolves from my country first to my race first to my clan first, and pretty soon you've got the Balkans or the Middle East right here in the United States. And part of the problem lies with us, because as a country, we as sort of a white guilt thing, we allowed black nationalism to foster. We allowed Latino nationalism to foster, instead of combating it philosophically as a matter of individual rights. Forget that you're Latino, forget that you're black, forget that you're white. We're all Americans. We're in this together, loving liberty and living life the very best we can. And instead, we embrace this notion of group rights, of tribalism, and now we're paying the price, not just in Dallas, but in the rise that we've seen of white nationalism in this country as a very natural response to the lax response of the rise of black and Latino nationalism and all the rest. You could even lump the third wave feminist movement in with the same thing. And as we further fracture and devolve into more and more races, nationalities, tribes, sexes, what have you, the more and more we are at each other's throats instead of enjoying a good roast with Dean Martin on TV.
Yeah, or a good roast barbecue just in the afternoon without fear of your life. Bill, yeah. Of all the things that we've allowed to foster or fester in this case is this epidemic of crime in the black inner cities. We've allowed it to happen. It's a form of prejudice too, I think. It's a form of, and by the way, it's not white against black prejudice. All of these inner cities are run by Democrats, and virtually all of them are run by pretty much all black city councils, Detroit and Chicago and all the rest. Scotty, let's go to you, because there's a story that you told us before that I liked so much. Maybe I'll give you a chance to tell it again. But The argument in favor of political correctness is we don't want to say anything that might offend somebody. We were going to, and the whole safe space thing and so on, we're going to continue to sanitize this. We're going to have a race to see who can be the biggest victim and who can be the most morally superior by not using any derogatory terms whatsoever. I think this is the exact same antithetical idea as the whole self-esteem movement. Tell kids they're great and then they'll succeed. No, they have to succeed and then they'll feel good. So do you think that political correctness, that this idea that you can't joke with people or be loose with people about the differences between them, has actually, in fact, not improved race relations, but on the contrary, just really thrown a lot of sand into the gears?
I think in many ways it has, and I'll get to that story in a minute. I want to tell you though, you guys don't know about this, but this morning, just 25 minutes from Dallas, I live very close to Dallas, and just 25 minutes from Dallas, I had an encounter that really, I think, illustrates the way that the racial atmosphere is right now. There was this black guy, kind of a scruffy beard, and wearing one of those, I don't even know what they're called. They used to call them do-rags. It's like a nylon thing on his head. Plus, he's got one of these flat brim baseball hats that's slightly off center. And this guy comes at me with a blade and gave me the smoothest neck shave I'd ever had. And this beautiful, did a great haircut. His name is Levon. We talked about music the whole time while he was waving those blades around my head, and just had a great time, and I gave him a handsome tip. And the point in telling you that story is, first of all, A, it really happened this morning. But B, is that I think that much of what we perceive to be the racial atmosphere of the country is something that is actually created by politicians and pundits who benefit by the promulgation of tension. As you know, as a film writer, Bill, you know you need to have tension. You need to have conflict in order to make a great story. And I think that it's boring for the mainstream media to say, hey, perfectly white Scott Ott went and got a haircut from perfectly black Levon this morning and, literally sat back in a chair while the guy waved a razor blade around his head. That's dull. But that's what happens most of the time in this country. And that's what I see in the streets, and I see at the soccer games and the baseball games and at the mall is perfect cooperation and harmony among imperfect people. It's not the problem it seems to be. But the story you were hinting at earlier was that I was raised by my grandfather, and he would often tell us stories, if we begged him, about his encounters in World War II. Most of his stories had nothing to do with shooting things or blowing things up. They were about stuff that happened, funny things that happened with his buddies, his comrades in arms. And almost everyone in his unit seemed to have, well, they all had nicknames, but almost all of the nicknames seemed to be like ethnic slurs. I mean, they were all related to, and one of the great things about World War II and kind of all the awful stuff that came out of it is that a bunch of these people from the American so-called melting pot got thrown together in army units from all over the country. And there were city kids and country kids, and there were Italians and Germans and Scots and Irish, and they were all thrown together. And he talks with nothing but affection about those guys. And when he's 70 years old, 80 years old, and he's scanning the newspaper and he says, oh, there's another obituary and then he uses an ethnic slur to describe one of his old buddies from the military. I got to go to his funeral. It's down in Philadelphia. These people loved each other. They realize, hey, we're all different. It's kind of goofy that we are, but it's okay to be, to have fun with it.
And to be different.
Yeah, and I think this is exactly what's been missing, is that sense that we would joke about our differences, from our racial differences or our national background differences, in the same way that a Florida Gator fan would tease a Florida State Seminole fan. They're worthless and they're horrible people, and
of course
they're responsible for all of the problems that we have here in this country. But when you can make that kind of joke openly, it diffuses what actual real tension might be there. If you look at the movies from World War II that Scott was talking about, the movies made during and after World War II, Scott's exactly right. There's always a guy from the Bronx. There's a guy named Tex who's from the middle of nowhere. He's in Oklahoma, or North Texas. Cowhand, and there's a guy from California, and he's a surfer dude. There's an Italian guy, and there's all of this stuff mixed together, and they call each other these names not as a way of demeaning each other, but as a way of almost identifying the fact that we're all from very different places and we're all wearing the same uniform and we're going out there and fighting the same bad guys and my life depends on you. I think this political correctness, I think the foundation of it in the beginning was in fact well-intentioned, that people wanted to remove ethnic slurs from the language, that there was a lot of subconscious slurs going out there and that these needed to be removed from the language. I have no problem with that. I think that's rather noble.
Sure.
But the two things I would like to say are this. Number one, the President of the United States and the Democratic Party cannot survive any national election without turning out 80-90% of the black vote, a huge percentage of the single mom vote. And so they have to have a war on black people and Black Lives Matter, and they have to have a Republican war on women, because if they don't get elected. They would rather divide the country up and rule over the ruins than to treat people honestly and fairly. But my final statement is simply this. I was watching, I wasn't watching, I used to be the editor of a show called Sunday Morning Shootout on AMC, and it was a movie talk show. It was great. It was really fun. I cut 183 episodes of that show.
Oh, wow.
And it was hosted by Peter Bart and Peter Guber, two gigantic Hollywood liberals who I thought were really quite good men. And they were so accustomed, they were so deep inside the system, that's why the show worked, that they could talk very, very casually with Tom Cruise. They could talk very casually with Clint Eastwood. They were friends. They all knew each other. But whenever they would have a black guest on, they treated them differently. They treated them much more deferentially. They treated them much more formally. They treated them much more carefully with that kind of eggshell kind of thing. And I was watching this live as it happened, and Obama was just getting known. This was probably late 2007. And one of them asked Lawrence Fishburne, I'm virtually sure it was Lawrence Fishburne, Lawrence, speaking as an African American, what do you think of this Barack Obama guy? And Lawrence Fishburne said without missing a beat, he said, "Is it okay if I answer that just as an American?"
Good for him.
Yeah, that is a kind of racism, and it's a kind of prejudice. This idea that people are so fragile, that black people are so fragile, or women are so fragile that you have to treat them carefully. It's not good. And finally, I'll just on a personal note that we can all three connect to. We've all had a chance to work with Alfonso Rachel, who I think is just one of the greatest warriors for the cause out there, as a champion of freedom. Terrific guy. And I was with him at a large lunch of conservatives, and they were speaking about him glowingly because of all the heat he was taking as a black conservative and all this stuff. And as we were walking out, I guess because I knew him better than most of the people, he said, I really do appreciate all that, but it would have been nice even if the people on my own team had just recognized me as another guy at the table rather than a black conservative champion who's taken a lot of heat for the cause. This colorblind society, I think, is easier to obtain if we're willing to joke about things with each other. I joke about a character named Andrew Clavin, who has been riding on my coattails for 5, 6, 7, 8 years at least. I mean, no one would have heard of him if it hadn't been for me. And this little kind of an interaction is how we get along. It's how we express affection. It's how we diffuse tensions and conflicts. So I say less political correctness. I say more of the kind of things that we saw in the Dean Martin roast, where people said what they wanted to, and the love underneath that trumped and clarified and magnified the surface sort of teasing. That's what allows all people to get along. We can go a lot further than this and do a lot better than this with this president. On behalf of everybody here at Right Angle, that's our Right Angle on race relations in the aftermath of Dallas. And for those of you watching the show who are not members, you should know that there's just a relatively small group of people who are paying for this, and we're very grateful for them. And if you'd like to become a member, you can go to billwhittle.com and take a look at it for yourself. Thanks again for everything. I'm Bill Whittle here with Steve Green and Scott Ott. We'll see you next time.
Mr. Davis, you are a great performer. The excitement you create in an audience is incredible. There they sit, spellbound, wondering if someone in your entourage is ransacking their room. From dancing for pennies to that magnificent moment when Frank Sinatra phoned down to the lobby and said, "Send the colored kid up to dance while I shave."